The day Edward Hartwell called me a fool in front of his entire household, something inside me hardened forever. I stood there with my eyes lowered, my hands clasped in front of my apron, while his voice cut through the room sharp and careless. He did not even look at me when he said it. I remember thinking that if I ever proved him wrong, it would cost me everything. I just did not know yet that it would also give me everything. My name is Vivian Ashford, and I was 23 years old when I arrived at Hartwell Manor on a gray October morning in the year 1847. The estate rose out of the mist like a thing half alive. Its stone walls were pale and worn, its tall windows watching the world like unblinking eyes. I stood at the iron gates with one small trunk at my feet, my breath fogging the cold air, and felt a strange certainty settle in my chest. This place did not feel like a home. It felt like a fortress, a place built to keep things in and people out. I had answered an advertisement for a housemaid position after London had taken everything from me. My father had been gone 2 years by then, taken slowly by illness, and the debts he left behind had swallowed what little we owned. The small house where I had grown up, the furniture my mother had chosen before she died, even my father's books were gone. All that remained was what he had put into my mind. Thomas Ashford had worked in a counting house for most of his life. At night, by candlelight, he taught me numbers, not because he thought a woman should know them, but because I was all he had. I learned to add and subtract before I learned to sew. I learned to read ledgers before I learned to curtsy. When he died, I learned something else. None of it mattered to the world. A woman with numbers in her head was still only a woman who needed work. Hartwell Manor was meant to be a fresh start. I told myself that as I walked the long gravel drive, my boots crunching softly, ancient trees lining the path like silent guards, I would be a maid here. I would scrub floors and polish silver. No one would know that numbers lived in my bones. Blackwood met me at the servants' entrance. She was tall and severe, her gray hair pulled back so tight it made her face sharp. Her eyes missed nothing. "You are younger than I expected," she said. "I am 23, ma'am," I replied, "and I work hard." She studied me for a moment, then turned and led me inside. The servants' quarters were narrow and dim, smelling of soap and coal smoke. I was shown a small room I would share with another maid named Lily, a quiet girl with frightened eyes who barely spoke above a whisper. The household was not large. Mrs. Blackwood ruled it all. Mr. Graves, the butler, moved like a shadow. Mrs. Peyton ran the kitchen. There were footmen and maids and the estate manager, Mr. Patrick. Silas Crawford, who handled all the Duke's business. And then there was the Duke himself. I did not meet Edward Hartwell during my first week. Mrs. Blackwood told me he preferred solitude. He ate alone, worked alone, and walked the halls late at night like a restless spirit. I was to stay out of his way. That suited me fine. The first crack appeared on my third Monday. I was helping in the kitchen when a delivery arrived. As the butcher's goods were unloaded, my mind counted without asking permission. When the invoice was signed, I knew it was wrong. I hesitated. It was not my place. But my father's voice echoed in my head. Numbers do not lie. People do. I spoke up. The cook laughed at me at first. Then she checked. I was right. The delivery was short. "Sharp eyes," she said afterward. "But keep that to yourself. Mr. Crawford does not like interference." I nodded, but the seed had been planted. I began to notice things. Supplies that grew poorer while costs stayed high. Repairs that never happened. Wages that were quietly reduced. The numbers did not add up. Still, I said nothing. The day I met the Duke came in the library. I was dusting shelves taller than anything I had ever seen, surrounded by books that made my heart ache. I did not hear him enter. "What are you doing?" His voice was close enough to make me flinch. I turned and found myself facing a tall man with dark hair and eyes the color of winter storms. He looked carved from stone. "I am cleaning, sir," I said. "You were reading." I was dusting. Something flickered in his eyes. He asked my name. He asked where I had served before. When I told him this was my first position, his mouth curved in something close to mockery. An untrained maid in my library. I am thorough, I said quietly. He studied me as if weighing something, then turned and left without another word. That night, Lily whispered who he was. Edward Hartwell, the Duke, a widower, changed since his wife died. A week later, I overheard an argument outside Mr. Crawford's office. The Duke demanded to see the accounts. Mr. Crawford spoke smoothly, calmly, but I heard fear beneath it. That night, I lay awake knowing something was wrong. Proof came with a wine delivery. I counted 18 crates. Mr. Crawford recorded 12. 6 crates vanished into thin air. I knew then. Someone was stealing from the estate, and only one man had access to everything. Days later, fate intervened. I was assigned to clean the library again. That afternoon, Mr. Crawford brought the ledgers. The Duke dismissed him, and then, to my shock, turned to me. "Can you read?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Then, look at these. Tell me what you see." I sat at the desk with my heart pounding and opened the first ledger. Hours passed. Patterns emerged. Subtle, careful theft hidden across years. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "You are being robbed, sir?" Silence followed. Then acceptance. The next morning, Mr. Crawford was gone. The Duke summoned me weeks later. He offered me a new position. Not as a maid, but as his secretary, higher wages, a room in the main house. I accepted. And without realizing it, I stepped across a line that could never be uncrossed. The day I left the servants' quarters, the house seemed to change its shape around me. The corridors felt wider, the ceilings higher, the silence heavier. I carried my small trunk up the stairs myself, refusing help, my back straight even though my hands trembled. I was no longer only a maid, but I was not yet anything else. I existed in a space between, and everyone at Hartwell Manor felt it. My new room was small but bright, with a window that looked out over the east gardens, a proper bed, a writing desk, a fire of my own. I sat on the edge of the mattress that first night and stared at my hands, hardly believing this was real. Everything I had ever been taught said this should not have happened. Women like me did not rise. They endured. The next morning, I reported to the Duke's study at 9 precisely. Edward Hartwell stood behind his desk, papers neatly arranged, his expression unreadable. "Sit," he said. I sat. We began with letters. Tenant complaints, supplier contracts, repair requests that had been ignored for years. He watched closely as I worked, as I checked figures, as I asked questions no one had ever asked him before. "You do not hesitate," he observed. "Numbers do not reward hesitation," I replied before thinking. For a moment, something like a smile touched his mouth. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. We worked side by side, often in silence, sometimes in sharp debate. He challenged me. I challenged him. Slowly, the estate began to heal. Repairs were made, fair contracts restored, wages corrected. People noticed. So did the household. Whispers followed me through corridors. Eyes lingered. Some servants treated me with new respect, others with open resentment. I learned to keep my head down and my work perfect. Perfection was my shield. Edward noticed everything. "You are carrying this house on your shoulders," he said one evening, as we reviewed accounts by firelight. "I'm doing my job," I replied. "No," he said quietly. "You are doing more." It was around that time that our conversations began to drift. Not far at first. A comment about a book. A question about my childhood. I told him about my father, about candlelit nights and columns of figures. He told me about Oxford, about dreams abandoned when duty called. One evening, he spoke of his wife. "She laughed when I asked for honesty," he said flatly. "That sound never leaves you." I did not know what to say, so I reached across the desk and placed my hand over his. He did not pull away. After that, everything changed. The air between us grew thick with things unspoken. His gaze lingered too long. My heart raced when I heard his footsteps. I told myself it was gratitude. Respect, Nothing more. I was lying. Winter came early. Snow fell thick and clean, turning Hartwell Manor into something unreal. One afternoon, I stood at the library window watching the world disappear beneath white. "You look like someone seeing snow for the first time," Edward said behind me. "It is different here," I replied. "Everything is different when you stop running," he said. I turned. His eyes were on me, intense and searching. "Vivian," he said, "you are not beautiful." The words struck hard, but I did not move. "And yet," he continued, "I cannot stop seeing you. I cannot stop thinking of you. You are in my thoughts even when you are not in the room." My breath caught. "This is not wise," I said. "I know. We must stop." I cannot. Neither could I. The first kiss came without warning. Desperate and fierce, it frightened me with its intensity. When it ended, I knew nothing would ever be simple again. We loved, in secret. Stolen moments, quiet touches, whispers in empty rooms. Edward changed. He laughed. He smiled. He lived. But rumors move faster than truth. Mrs. Blackwood warned me one morning. The village was talking. The word mistress followed me like a shadow. That night, I told Edward everything. He refused to let me go. "I have lived by rules that gave me nothing," he said. "I will not lose you. I will not ruin you," I replied. I made my choice by dawn. I packed my things before the sun rose. I was tying the last ribbon when the door opened. Edward stood there breathless, eyes wild. "I will marry you," he said. I laughed through tears. "It is impossible. I am the Duke. I decide what is possible." He knelt and offered me his mother's ring. I said yes. The world exploded. Our marriage shocked everyone. Society turned its back. Invitations stopped. Names were whispered with scorn. But we stood together. Love was not gentle. It was work. It was choice. It was standing firm when the world pushed back. Years passed. We built schools, shelters, lives. We gave where we could. And when hope seemed gone, it returned. I was with child at 38. Fear shadowed every joy. The birth nearly took me. Edward held my hand and prayed. Our daughter lived. Hope. She grew strong and bright. She healed wounds we had forgotten. Society softened. Time dulled sharp tongues. And one evening, as Edward watched our daughter sleep, he whispered, "You counted correctly after all." I smiled. But life had one more lesson to teach us. Hope changed the shape of our lives in ways I never expected. From the moment I held her, small and warm against my chest, the world seemed to rearrange itself around her existence. She was not just a child. She was proof. Proof that love could survive scandal, that joy could follow loss, that something beautiful could grow from soil the world had declared barren. Edward became someone new with her in his arms. The cold distance that had once defined him vanished. He sang to her in the evenings in a voice that cracked and wandered off key. He walked the halls at night with her resting against his shoulder, whispering promises he thought only she could hear. I watched him and fell in love all over again. Motherhood was not gentle with me. I was older than most women when I gave birth, and my body reminded me of it often. There were days I felt weak and afraid, days when I wondered if I had asked too much of fate. But every time doubt crept in, hope would curl her fingers around mine, and I would remember why I fought. Society did not change overnight. Some doors stayed closed. Some smiles remained forced. There were women who would speak to Edward warmly and barely acknowledge me standing beside him. There were men who praised his management of the estate while pretending I did not exist. I learned to endure it with quiet grace. Edward never pretended it did not hurt. "One day," he said once, "watching a carriage pass us by without stopping, they will forget what they hated and remember only what we built." I believed him. The estate flourished. With honest accounts and careful planning, Hartwell Manor became prosperous again. Tenants lived in homes that were repaired and warm. Wages were fair. The village grew. People had work. Children had food. The school became my greatest pride. I stood before rows of children holding slates and chalk, teaching them the language my father had given me. Numbers, letters, truth written plainly so no one could steal it from them. You do not need to fear figures, I told them. They are only honest. Some of the girls stayed after lessons, eyes bright with hunger for more. I saw myself in them. I made sure they learned. The women's home grew too. Women arrived broken and frightened. Some with children, some alone. We gave them safety and skill. Many left standing taller than when they arrived. Critics called it foolish charity. I called it justice. Years passed quietly after that. Joy and sorrow moved through our lives the way seasons moved through the land. Hope grew fast. She learned to read early. Her favorite place was the library. She counted everything. Steps, books, birds on the lawn. She has your mind, Edward said proudly, and your stubbornness, I replied. When Hope was 7, we attended our first grand gathering in years. Edward insisted it was time. For her, he said. She should not grow up thinking the world is only rejection. The ballroom was bright and loud and filled with people who once turned away from us. Some greeted us warmly, others cautiously. I wore my head high. Edward's arm was steady beneath my hand. Hope charmed them all without effort. She is remarkable, one woman said. She is loved, I replied. That night something shifted. Invitations followed. Conversation softened. The past did not vanish, but it loosened its grip. I learned then that time does not erase wounds. It simply teaches people how to live around them. Edward grew older gracefully. Silver threaded his hair. Lines settled around his eyes. He was still strong, still sharp. Still the man who listened when I spoke and trusted what I saw. One evening, years later, we sat by the fire while Hope practiced piano downstairs. Edward looked at me for a long moment. You saved my life, he said. No, I replied. You chose it. He smiled. We faced another loss not long after. Mrs. Blackwood passed quietly in her sleep. The house mourned her deeply. She had ruled Hartwell Manor with discipline and care. I stood at her grave and whispered my thanks. Without her, none of this would have been possible. As Hope grew into a young woman, she became aware of our story. Children always do. Why did people hate you? She asked one evening. They did not hate us, I said gently. They feared what they did not understand. And you did not care? I cared, I admitted, but I cared more about being honest. She thought about that for a long time. Years later, she would thank me for it. When Hope left for school, the house felt too quiet. Edward and I walked the grounds together in the evenings. We talked about everything and nothing. We argued about numbers and laughed about old mistakes. Love did not fade. It deepened. One autumn, as leaves fell thick and red, Edward fell ill. It was not sudden, but it was serious. I sat by his bed every night, holding his hand, counting his breaths the way my father once counted figures by candlelight. You cannot count your way out of this, he teased weakly. I can try, I said through tears. He recovered slowly. Life reminded us again that nothing is permanent. Not power, not strength. Not time. When Hope returned home with news of her engagement, Edward wept openly. The man who once feared love would destroy him now trusted it enough to let his daughter go. Our home filled with laughter again. Another wedding. Another beginning. Now I sit in the same study where everything began. The ledgers rest neatly on shelves. The fire burns low. Edward reads nearby. Hope's laughter drifts in from another room. I think often of the girl who stood at the iron gates with one small trunk and nothing else. She thought her life was ending. She did not know it was beginning. I was called foolish once, a maid who could not count. But I counted then, and I count now. I count love given and returned. Lives changed. Truth defended. A family built from courage instead of fear. The numbers tell the story clearly. I was never a fool. I was simply brave enough to look.